In the Risk of Rain 2 1.0 update, we've had a bunch of new items added to the game, none more interesting than the Purity. The Purity is a new lunar item unlocked by beating the game on Monsoon, which is quite a task considering you have to deal with Mithrix on Monsoon difficulty. Even though it's one of the hardest items to unlock, I actually ranked it as F tier in my recent tier list video. Why is this? Well, you see, the Purity is actually the counter item to the 57 leaf clover, meaning that it has a negative luck stat added to it. Now, for those of you who don't know what the 57 leaf clover is, as it is another difficult item to get, the 57 leaf clover gives you +1 luck, which essentially means that anytime there is a chance for something to occur, for example, if you are to be lit on fire or for you to proc a sticky bomb, and you don't proc either of those things, it will roll for a beneficial effect. In terms of being lit on fire, it will try to make sure that you don't get lit on fire, and in terms of procking sticky bombs, it will try to roll for more sticky bombs. So in other words, the 57 leaf clover will force some of your items to proc. Now, the Purity on the other hand will do the opposite. It will try to make sure that you don't proc the sticky bombs and you do get lit on fire. However, the Purity does have one other effect with it, which is reducing all cooldowns by -2 seconds and -1 second for every subsequent stack. Because of this, some people have been commenting that maybe the Purity is good on certain survivors, which has led me to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Purity isn't F tier like I thought. Maybe this item does have some uses on certain survivors and can be used in certain builds. Now, don't get me wrong, I still think that the Purity is hot garbage because it worsens the on-hit effects, and on-hit effects are the best items in the game. But maybe, just maybe, when you're playing a very specific survivor, you will be able to see a Purity and go, okay, I'll pick that up. And I know what some of you are going to say, why even worry about the Purity when there's Alien Head and Hard Light Afterburner, which have higher cooldown reduction and no negative effects to it? Well, first off, the Purity is a little bit more easier to get. All you have to do is go to a lunar portal, and usually there will be a Purity in the shop, whereas the legendary drop chances are really low unless you get the guaranteed one from the allied worship unit or the legendary chest. And even then, you don't get to choose which legendary you get, so it's not really that great. Also, the Hard Light Afterburner and the Alien Head stack really well with the Purity, which I'll mention later on. So there you go. That's why we're worried about the Purity and not the Alien Head or the Hard Light Afterburner. Just wanted to address that since I know some people are going to be asking about it. So here's what I did. I ran a little experiment on all survivors except the Captain. The reason I chose not to do it on the Captain is because he has the best M1 in the game, and I would never ruin that by picking up a Purity, but also because he has literally no synergy with it. I mean, half his abilities don't even work in certain areas, so yeah, we're not trying it on him. So here are the survivors that we are going to be doing it on. We're going to be doing it on Acrid, Artificer, Commando, Engineer, Huntress, Loader, Mercenary, MUL-T, and Rack. So everyone but the Captain. Before I start every single one, I just want to mention what I believe the reason that the Purity is good on them is, and that way you can make your own conclusions based off of your thoughts and my thoughts. Maybe I missed something, or maybe you missed something, and we can put our brains together and conclude whether or not the Purity is the best item on this survivor. Alright, let's start out with Acrid. Now, Acrid seems like he would do really well with Purity. Both of Acrid's M2s, Neurotoxin and Ravenous Bite, are very, very short cooldown abilities, only having a 2-second cooldown on their abilities. Now, if you were paying attention to the beginning, you would know that Purity reduces your cooldown by 2 seconds on one stack. So in theory, Acrid would have a 0-second cooldown on both of his abilities. While in theory this would work, it does not actually work in Risk of Rain 2 as there is a global cooldown on skills. Even if the Purity gets it to 0 seconds, it will stop automatically at 0.5 seconds. So regardless of how many Purities you stack, you will never get it to go below 0.5 seconds. So stacking more than one Purity on Acrid is pretty dumb if you're only going for the M2 spam. Regardless, I still think that this is pretty viable just because of the fact you can reduce your Neurotoxin and Ravenous Bite cooldown to basically the minimum amount that it can be. This means that melee Acrid could be viable and ranged Acrid is still viable, just even stronger now. For the Neurotoxin, you might be able to actually proc items more often because you don't have to wait for the 2-second cooldown. So it might be a boon to have the Purity rather than a negative effect. But anyway, let's get into it and let's actually see what it's like. For starters, I want to point out that I use the artifact of command for this because I don't want to have to randomly go through every stage and try to look for the items I need. I just want to represent what I thought would be good without having to, rely on luck for the items to drop. So anyway, I started out the run, tried to find a blue portal immediately, and I got a backup magazine. Now there's an interesting mechanic when it comes to having a backup magazine with the purity, which I'll explain here in a second. But when you see I pick up the purity, you can tell that my neurotoxin has 100% uptime, so I can now spam it on anything like it's my primary M1. With just one purity, Acrid has become a ranged survivor. Now as you can see, I barely have 100% uptime on it, and that's because of the backup magazine. The way the backup magazine works is that you use one ability and then immediately it starts cooling down. So for Acrid, I have a 0.5 second cooldown on my second ability, and the backup magazine is immediately cooling down as soon as I use my first neurotoxin. I can't cast neurotoxin quick enough for the backup magazine to go off full cooldown. And here's where I found another interesting mechanic. Soldier Syringe actually allows you to not only use your M1 quicker, but also cast other abilities quicker. So in this case, I can pick up a Soldier Syringe and I'll be able to reach the max cap that the backup magazine will allow me to reach. This isn't the DPS max either, because I can just pick up more backup magazines every time I pick up more Soldier Syringes. Now it's kind of unrealistic to expect that I can get 10 plus backup mags and 10 plus Soldier Syringes in normal games, but because of the new 3D printers, maybe. Anyway, as the game progressed, I kept going through. I got a couple of proc items just to see if I could ever proc any of them with one single purity. The result, sadly, is that you basically will not proc items even with just one purity. Even though I could spam my neurotoxin as much as I wanted, as quick as I wanted, I still couldn't proc that many items with it. The ukulele has about a 25% chance to proc, and it was not procking very often. The ATG missile has a 10% chance to proc, and I rarely, if ever, saw an ATG missile. I even got a tri-tip dagger towards the end, which has a 15% chance to bleed enemies, and I tested it out on one of the boss type enemies, and I didn't even see a single bleed proc off of a 15% chance item with a single purity. Also, and I don't know if anyone knows this, but crit chance is affected by purity and 57 leaf clover, meaning that you won't actually be able to get the guaranteed crit chance until you have maxed it out. What I mean by this is when you have 50% crit, which would be 5 Lensmaker's Glasses, it's not actually 50% crit. However, once you reach 100% crit, and it has to happen every time, purity cannot affect that chance. This goes for other items like tri-tip daggers, where if you get 7 and your proc coefficient is 1, then you will guaranteed be bleeding. But until then, you will not have the guaranteed chance, and the purity will be messing with your proc chances. Interesting little tidbit, thought I'd share with you. Regardless, this is still a viable build for Acrid if you get a couple items with you. If you have a couple backup magazines and maybe a Soldier Syringe or two, picking up a purity would actually not be bad. Sure, some of your on-hit items aren't going to be proccing as much, but with Acrid, a 2-second cooldown on your secondary ability is going to prevent you from proccing anyway. Plus, if you find a 57 leaf clover, it cancels out the purity but gives you only the benefit of the purity, so that's a pretty good deal. At the very least, Acrid is viable with it with his neurotoxin. Now let's take a very quick look at Ravenous Bite. Melee Acrid is, let's just say, not viable because you just can't heal quick enough. 10% of your max health over 0.5 seconds sounds good, but most things in the game are going to be killing you way quicker than that. Since there's actually a 2-second downtime for your ability to heal, you're probably not going to be able to get into the mix of things, so to speak. However, with the purity, we might be able to reduce that to 0.5 seconds. And with the backup magazine, we can almost indefinitely be healing that 10% of our health. So let's check it out. I just want to point out that it doesn't really matter what you get on Acrid for the other items, but Renault's Band is pretty good for melee Acrid because your third hit on Acrid does that 400% damage that you need to proc Kajaros and Renault, so it's a pretty good item. So, mwah. Other than that, all we need is a backup magazine and we can make this build work. So we go to a lunar altar and then we go to the lunar portal and we pick ourselves up a purity. As you can see, 100% uptime on our M2, aka Ravenous Bite, which means 100% uptime on our 10% health regeneration. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure if the health regeneration stacks, so getting past the 0.5 seconds of the health regeneration. So for example, like say that I hit them 3 times with a Ravenous Bite in that 0.5 seconds, does it give me 30% of my health or does it just restart the health regeneration? Not sure, and honestly, I wasn't really paying too much attention. Regardless, I just go face first into a boss just to see if this is viable, and you can really play melee Acrid. First thing to note about this is that you actually can't use your M1 while you're holding down your M2, unlike the Mercenary. The Mercenary can do this, so Acrid's a little weak in this department, but you can still use your other abilities while you're doing it, so your shift and your special are still active. So the first boss is the Clay Dune Strider, and I almost get clapped. Even with 100% uptime on my M2, and this being only stage 2 at 6 minutes, I'm almost dead to a teleporter boss. This is with me spamming my M2 as quickly as I can. I'm literally just holding the M2 down and I'm almost dying. A Clay Dune Strider isn't the most fair boss to be comparing this to, as it does kind of chunk you pretty hard. But regardless, the point is you should still be able to do it, especially with a 0.5 second cooldown on your abilities. Honestly, I've been thinking this for a while, but now I definitely think they should up the health regeneration to 20%. The reason for this being is that the 20% would allow you to regenerate double the amount of health that you're already healing, so you can actually face tank things, while also giving you the option for a rejuvenation rack to double your healing to 40%. This might sound broken, but really the only time this is ever going to happen is later in the game when you can guarantee get a rejuvenation rack and get a purity, and even then malachite enemies can still kill you, so it's kind of balanced. Just throwing out Acrid buff ideas out there if anyone's listening. So continuing on with the run, knowing that I need to increase the amount of attack speed I have so I can cast Ravenous Bite quicker, I pick up another Soldier Syringe, and hopefully this will up my regen enough that I won't die. I go to the next stage with 2 Soldier Syringes and 2 backup magazines. Once I start the teleporter event, I see it's an Imp Overlord, and this is probably going to be a little rough. I can dodge some of its attacks if I go up, but now there is a Clay Templar hitting me the entire time, so I have to kind of use the Imp Overlord as a body block. I'm literally holding down my M2 as hard as I can, and I'm still really not beating the amount of damage I'm taking. Although I do end up killing the Imp Overlord, the Clay Templar chunks me down, and I dive to the Imp Overlord's bleed. And that was only stage 3, and how long? What time was it? About 11 minutes. So is this Acrid build actually viable with the purity? I don't know. Having a purity from stage 1 and having 2 backup magazines and 3 soldier syringes, I still was getting chunked by thing. On paper and in theory, this build looks good, but in practice, I'm still getting beat up by Imp Overlords on stage 3. Maybe if you ran this with some razor wire, it could be good, but I still have to say, melee Acrid, even with the most broken combo I could find, isn't very strong. Deemed that Neurotoxin, his first M2, is actually good with the purity, while also finding out that Ravenous Bite could be good with the purity, but it's just too weak of an ability right now, so it's not. In other words, Acrid passes the test and is viable with the purity, just don't stack more than one on him. Next up, let's talk about the Commando. Now this is one of the survivors I wanted to test the most with the purity because he could do some crazy things with it. Looking at some of the Commando's cooldowns, we have Phased Round, which is 3 seconds, Phased Blast, which is 3 seconds, Tactical Dive, which is 4 seconds, Tactical Slide, which is 4 seconds, Suppressive Fire 9 seconds, and Frag Grenade 5 seconds. The most interesting abilities out of them would be Phased Blast, which is a 3 second cooldown, meaning you would need 2 purities to reduce it to 0.5 second cooldown. This is because the first purity gives you 2 second cooldown and every subsequent one gives you 1 second cooldown. And we wouldn't be getting the full effect because the 3 seconds is cooled down to 1 second, and since the global cooldown is 0.5 seconds, the next purity that we get is only going to cool it down to 0.5 seconds. However, having 2 purities makes Tactical Slide and Tactical Dive only on a 1 second cooldown. Also, Frag Grenade will only be on a 2 second cooldown. Anyway, so let's get into the game and let's see how it actually progressed throughout the run. First, I pick up a bunch of backup magazines because after I realized with Acrid that M2s are really powerful once you get enough backup magazines and a purity, I wanted to stack them a lot. And every other item there is just for speed, regen, etc, and I just wanted to see if the ukulele could ever proc with, 2 purities. However, once I finally got there, I realized that 2 isn't enough. I want 3 to reduce my cooldown on my Tactical Slide to nothing. You'll see why here in a second. So sliding around the map is cool and all, but how about hovering across the map? What some people don't know about Commando is when you're in the air, you actually use your jetpack instead of sliding. This means you can float in the air and you're one of the most mobile survivors in the game now. Because I have 3 purities, there is only a 0.5 second cooldown on my shift. This means that I can just hold down my shift button and I'll continuously go up. I will never go down as long as I'm using my shift. Who needs Ion Surge on Artificer when you have your shift on Commando? Not being able to proc items is a small price to pay for the gift of flight. Now, I actually lost footage of my last time trying to do this on Commando. I was using frag grenades and it was a very interesting time. I only had 2 purities, so it wasn't like crazy like this one was. However, in this run, I was trying to get suppressive fire down to as low as I could. So admittedly, this run was a little bit of a meme, but I had to see suppressive fire at the minimum cooldown that I could. Sadly, suppressive fire has a cooldown of 9 seconds. Now, because you get the 2 seconds from the first one, you need 7 more to get it to the minimum cooldown possible. My thought was that if I could get suppressive fire down all the way to a 0.5 second cooldown, I'd be able to spam it. And since it scales with attack speed, it would be my best ability. What I came to realize was suppressive fire isn't good to get all the way down. I mean, in theory it would be, but you have 7 purities at that point, and suppressive fire really doesn't do that much damage. But because I'm a merciful god, I re-recorded, and I will show you some of the commando with only 2 purities, so it's not a goofy suppressive fire run. I will say that I've been finding the cloak chest a surprising amount while I'm trying to record these, so I think I found about 3. This is the 3rd one. It's really weird. Anyway, I got lucky and found a legendary item on the first stage, so I just picked up an alien head for reduced cooldown, which by the way, the purity stacks really well with the flat cooldown reduction of alien head and hard light afterburner because it stacks after their reductions. So in the case of the alien head, you get the 25% cooldown reduction, and then the purity does the -2 seconds from that. So for the alien head, my utility skill has a 4-second cooldown. The alien head reduces that by 25% to a 3-second cooldown. Then my purity takes it down by 2 seconds because it's 1 stack. That means I only have a 1-second cooldown on my tactical slide. Pretty poggers. Also, because I have an alien head, I don't actually have to stack 2 purities to get my phase blast down to the minimum 0.5 second cooldown. As with a 3-second cooldown, the alien head will reduce it to 2.3 seconds, and then the purity will reduce that by 2 seconds, which will be 0.3 seconds, which of course you can't get because the maximum is 0.5 seconds. So it is reduced all the way that it can be with 1 alien head and 1 purity. Boom, write that down, peepo notes. So after picking up the purity at the lunar altar, I now have the maximum amount of cooldown reduction that I can have for my M2. So anyways, I started blasting. You need to pick up a couple soldier syringes so that you can cast at that maximum attack speed that you can. And then constantly stacking backup magazines allows you to shoot even more. So is purity viable on the commando? Yes, it definitely is. 1 single purity is really good on the commando, and if you get lucky enough to find an alien head, it's even better on the commando. Stacking more than 1 purity on the commando is kind of a meme and is not going to do you any good. In fact, it'll probably do you worse. Avoid trying to get max cooldowns on your specials because it's just not going to happen, and rely entirely on your M2 spam with a bunch of backup magazines and a couple soldier syringes just so you can do it faster. Alright, so that's Acrid, that's commando. Who's next? Let's go to the Artificer. So in theory, you would think that the Artificer is one of the best purity carriers in the game. This is because Artificer relies heavily on cooldowns, and having lower cooldowns will obviously make her do better, right? I mean, the whole reason that I started this video in the first place was because a lot of people were asking me, is it good on the Artificer? And I thought to myself, good question. Is the purity good on survivors with high cooldown abilities that kind of rely on them? Problem is, as I was going through this, I realized something very important. Artificer kind of sucks even with all of her cooldowns reduced to next to nothing. Sadly, the global cooldown affects her primary ability, so she can never fire faster than the 0.5 seconds, which makes her worse than every other survivor in the game when it comes to cooling down their abilities. Now, to be fair, her M1 is just about as strong as other survivors' M2s, so it kind of balances out a bit, but unlike getting more backup magazines on these other survivors, Artificer really has no other way of scaling her M1. This means that we're going to be having to rely on her M2 to be the scaling ability. So basically, much like every other survivor on the list. However, her M2 is way stronger than almost any other survivor's M2, I believe. It does 2000% damage if you have the charged nano bomb and 1200% damage if you do have the nano spear. You do have to charge these abilities all the way up. However, attack speed makes the charge time quicker, so you can just stack more soldier syringes. The very, very sad part that I learned while doing this is that while you are charging your ability, so if you have an M2 that requires charging or activating, your ability actually doesn't start cooling down until you release it. So it doesn't even matter how much attack speed, how many backup mags, or how low the cooldown is, you will always have a finite amount of charged nanobombs that you're going to be able to throw out. Because as soon as you throw that first charged nanobomb, you start charging the next charged nanobomb, which then stops the process of the cooldown. Also, take a look at this right here. Take a look at this little clip. Do you see anything wrong here? Do you see anything going on? Well, the Artificer's flamethrower actually does not start cooling down until the flamethrower is over. This means reducing its cooldown is kind of useless. There's always going to be a downtime for the special. If you have an alien head, it reduces the cooldown to 3.8 seconds. Then you get one purity that reduces it to 1.8 seconds. Even if you grabbed another purity, you're only going to be reducing it by 1 second, so it still have a 0.8 second cooldown. This basically throws all of Artificer specials out the window since Ion Surge is a joke, and cooling that down would be kind of hilarious, I suppose. But just being able to go further in the air more often is not very special, let me tell you. Also, even if the flamethrower was a 100% cooldown reduction, it still wouldn't be that good because it does not scale with attack speed. Finally, the issue with purity on the Artificer is that her cooldowns are basically there so you can have a set rotation with the Artificer. By this I mean that you use all of your abilities in a certain order, and by the time that you're fully through the rotation, all of them should be off cooldown again so you can do the rotation yet again, using your higher cooldown skills and then your lower cooldown skills while you wait for the higher cooldown skills to come off cooldown. Most smart and experienced Artificers really don't have a problem with their cooldown reduction, as everything comes off cooldown as soon as you're done using the previous ability. So having a purity on the Artificer really doesn't do anything for you. It could have been pretty cheesy with the new charged nanobomb, but because of the fact that it does not cool down until after you're done charging it, well, it makes it pretty bad. So we're going to go ahead and give it an F tier on the Artificer. Just pick up an alien head, that'll serve you way better. That's the Artificer, Acrid, and Commando all done. Who is next on the list? Oh, let's do Loader. Let's do Loader. This is a point I'm going to be trying to make here because I was told, and this is key, I was told that the backup magazine is the key to Loader being so mobile. Now, I'm not the greatest Loader player. In fact, I really don't like playing the Loader for several reasons. I really don't like the fact that every time you try to charge something or an ability on Loader, it cancels your sprint. But your sprint is supposed to increase her speed while you're doing her abilities, which increases your damage with them. And my keybind's still on control, which is the base on the PC, and it's really annoying to try to sprint again, and it's just uncomfortable, and I don't like playing her. But regardless, people were telling me that the backup magazine was really good on the Loader. I said, oh, well, I don't think that it's that much better on the Loader than it is anyone else. And people were like, OMG, how can you think that the backup magazine isn't that good on Loader? Well, I just looked at the Artificer, and guess what? Charged abilities don't come off cooldown until you're done using that charged ability. Guess who else has a charged M2? That is Loader. Now, I'm going on this tangent because it somewhat explains why the purity isn't going to be good on the Loader. But also a little bit because people were flabbergasted that I thought the backup magazine wasn't really that good on Loader, and now that I figured out that it doesn't actually work that well on the Loader, I'm even more in a tizzy. So if any of you are watching this video, I want you to explain to me how the secondary could be that good when you always have to wait 5 seconds for each separate backup magazine to cool down. That means that you have to wait 10 seconds for 2 backup magazines, you have to wait 15 seconds for 3, and so on and so forth. I went into this thinking that the Loader secondary, Spiked Fist, the alternate one that actually does damage, could kind of be used like a ranged weapon. The cooldown is about 5 seconds, so with the alien head and some purity misuse, I might be able to get it so it's low enough I could use it as a ranged weapon. However, it's not going to work for 2 reasons. One, whenever the Loader casts the ability, it has to reach out and grab its target. And so the cast time in between that, so the time it takes to reach the enemy and then hit them, your skill is stuck. It's frozen. That means it cannot cool down. And all the other backup magazines also cannot cool down until the fist returns to Loader's gauntlet or whatever you want to call it. This means that the travel time of the Spike Fist actually reduces the amount of time you're going to be able to use the Spike Fist. Which is pretty lame, but hey, you know, I guess that's balance. And of course, the second thing being that you need several purities for this to work, and the ranged attack would not have any on-hit effects at that point. If you have 3 purities, you're not really proccing anything. So I switched up the strategy, and I thought, well, maybe I can use Charged Gauntlet instead, and this will be a viable build for Loader. My initial thought was stacking attack speed with a bunch of purities so that there was a low cooldown on my Charged Gauntlet, and my Charged Gauntlet would almost instantly go off because attack speed actually increases the cast speed of Charged Gauntlet. But as with a couple of the other builds, I realized that there's no way you're going to get as much soldier syringes or attack speed that you need reliably outside of a Artifact of Command run, so I was like, nah, this isn't going to work. That being said, I remembered that Thunder Gauntlet does not actually need to be charged up, so that means that with the alternate utility skill for Loader, we actually don't need attack speed. As long as we reduce the cooldown as far as we can, it will immediately go off, regardless of how fast we can attack. I thought this and the Renault's Band Blast Shower build that I was running would be pretty poggers on the Loader. And when I played it out, it ended up pretty juicy. 1 purity plus a hard light afterburner means that you can essentially just use your Loader utility skill to move you around the map. Your grappling hook does basically nothing at this point. You'll probably notice that I ended up with the Blast Shower build, which makes this build look a little bit more impressive considering the fact I'm one-shotting literally everything on the map, but in reality it's not really that hard to get. The whole reasoning behind this Blast Shower build is that the Blast Shower removes the Renault and Kajaro's band cooldown because it counts as a debuff. So if you grab a Gesture of the Drown, which reduces the Blast Shower's cooldown by 50%, that gives the Blast Shower a cooldown of 10 seconds. Then with a couple of fuel cells, that will reduce it even further. If you end up with a Soulbound Catalyst, every time you get a kill, you'll reduce it by 4 seconds. With enough Gesture of the Drown and fuel cells, this will mean that you will get your Renault's band and Kajaro's band debuff removed every time you get a kill. And like I said, this build really isn't that hard to come by because you can guarantee a lot of the items. Abandoned Aqueduct allows you to get Renault's and Kajaro's band for free. All you have to do is kill Renault and Kajaro in that little hidden gate. Then to get the Blast Shower, all you have to do is get lucky on an equipment drop or go to stage 5 where there are equipment terminals. And of course you get a chance for the legendary drop from Abyssal Death Siren's Call. But even without all of those items, it's still really good to have the Charged Gauntlet and the Thunder Gauntlet on a 3-second cooldown. I recommend that you only get 1 purity, as 1 purity plus a hard light afterburner or an alien head will basically make it infinite anyway. Although because it's Loader and you're not going to be proccing things that often anyway, you could probably run 1 or 2 more purities just to get the cooldown lower. So boom, there you go. Loader is good with the purity. Next, let's talk about Rex, and Rex is a lot like the Loader in where I thought I was going to be using his M2 to break the game, and instead I ended up using his utility. You see, Rex has an M2 which already has a 0.5 second cooldown. That is Seed Barrage, and that's his first skill. Can't be reduced any further, so using purity with it is pretty dumb. Instead, I threw on Directive Drill, which is his alternate, which has a 6-second cooldown. This one does 450% damage per second over the course of 3 seconds. It has a 6-second cooldown, so this means just with purities, I would have to use 5 purities total just to get to the reduced cooldown. I ended up only using 4 as I wasn't casting it quick enough for the 0.5 seconds to really matter. And here's where I discovered the actual good part of the build. Because I had stacked so many purities, I had a 0.5 second cooldown on my Bramble Volley, which is the alternate utility skill for Rex. His initial loadout is Directive Disperse, which fires a sonic boom that weakens all enemies hit. It doesn't do any damage. The one I was using was Bramble Volley, and it costs 20% of your HP, but it fires a sonic boom that damages enemies for 550% damage and heals you for every target hit. Because it literally had no cooldown because I had so many purities, I didn't have to worry about anything and I could just point it in a direction and shoot. Because this ability does over the 400% damage that you need for Kajaro's and Renault's to proc, I could have just ran the exact same build that I did on Loader with Rex, that being the Renault's and Blast Shower build plus an afterburner with only a single purity, which would have gave me enough cooldown reduction to spam it infinitely. Well, actually you still need 2, but whatever. Here's me shredding a boss with it as an example of why this build is still viable. I was going to show you me beating the allied warship unit with it, but this happened. Yeah. So is the purity good on Rex? It's doable. That's what we'll call it. It's doable. It's not really that great, but if you can use the utility skill and get the Blast Shower Renault's band build going, it's okay. So who's left? We have Huntress, Mercenary, and Engineer. And MUL-T. Let's talk about MUL-T real quick. It'll be really short. MUL-T is the kind of robot that really does not do well with the purity. Only one of his primaries even look like it would do well with the purity, and that is the Scrap Launcher, which recently got buffed. But because of how weird the cooldown is for the Scrap Launcher, it actually does not work with purity at all. Alright, saying at all is kind of strong, but it really doesn't work well. It reduces the cooldown to a 0.5 seconds and it will refill all 4, but it will only do that once you've used all 4 in the first place. So it's still pretty bad. And the rest of MUL-T skills really don't work that well with purity either because they're not very good. Blast Canister is a 6-second cooldown, so that means you would have to stack multiple purities. Transport Mode is probably one of the worst utility skills in terms of damage because half the enemies are in the air and this skill can only hit ground units. Although you could be running in Hard Light Afterburner and Purity to make this a little bit more doable, it's still not a very good utility skill, so no. And finally, Retool is his special and it has literally no cooldown. So MUL-T in general is just not fit for the purity. Huntress is another example of a survivor that does not do well with purity. Her laser glaive, her secondary M2, is a 7-second cooldown, meaning that you'll have to stack multiple purities for it to even be viable, which of course on Huntress is not very good since she wants to be proccing on hits. She's one of the better survivors for it. And her utility skill is a blink, which has no damage whatsoever. It also has a 7-second cooldown, with the alternate having a 2-second cooldown per charge, although that skill is kind of inferior to the blink. And finally, her 2 special abilities, Arrow, Rain, and Ballista, are 12-second cooldowns, which means multiple purities for it to work. Although it does look terrible on paper, I did try it out on the Huntress, and yeah, it's terrible in practice as well. It's just not very good to run on the Huntress, so avoid it at all costs. But now let's talk about a survivor that does well with a purity. Oh wait, I don't want to spoil it. Forget I said that. Mercenary has a bunch of skills with pretty low cooldowns that make it look like the purity would do well on him. Take for example his secondary skills, both with 2.5 second cooldowns, meaning one purity would perfectly put it at 0.5 seconds, which is the global cooldown. Blinding Assault, his utility skill, also has a pretty low cooldown compared to other utility skills with 8 seconds. And his final skill, Eviscerate, we won't talk about Slicing Winds, let's avoid that at all costs, but Eviscerate has a 6-second cooldown. Plus, every third hit from his primary laser sword will reduce all cooldowns by 1 second. So in theory, the Mercenary looks like a pretty good purity carrier. I tried it out for myself and basically made the Mercenary a Beyblade. Essentially what happens is that with one single purity, you are allowed to spam your M2 off cooldown. This has a funny effect on the Mercenary, as he can either be a ballerina or he could slowly float up in the air in circles. Because Whirlwind propels you forward, you can actually fly using Whirlwind. An also interesting interaction is that you can spam your M1 while you're actually spinning in the air. This allows you to apply your Expose and lower the cooldowns on all your remaining abilities. Is it the strongest thing ever? Probably not. Is it pretty goofy and pretty entertaining to play? Yes. Is the purity viable on the Mercenary? Also yes. Here I showcase the M2 spam with the purity, but you could still go the Afterburner Mercenary where you get the purity and the Afterburner, and it's basically infinite amounts of blinding assaults. Both ways work, and it's a pretty good item on the Mercenary if you just feel like having fun. And finally, we have the Engineer. Is the Engineer actually good with the purity? God forgive me for what I'm about to do, because this is blasphemous. Looking at the Engineer skills, we have his M2s, which are both 8-second cooldowns. This means multiple purities just to be able to get them down. Also, his utilities, which one is Bubble Shield for a 25-second cooldown, meaning there's basically no amount of purities you're ever going to be able to get reliably that can reduce that down. The Thermal Harpoons, however, have a 2.75-second cooldown, meaning that one purity can reduce that pretty drastically. You'll still have 0.75-second cooldown on your Harpoons, but still, that's a lot less than 2.75 seconds. And of course, his specials, which are both turrets with 30-second cooldowns, are no way possible to get enough purities for that to work out. So basically, in the Engineer, the only thing that's really viable for him is getting the Thermal Harpoon cooldown lowered. Now, I tried it out myself, and you only need one single purity for it to work out. However, I just don't like the ability. Thermal Harpoons is really weird to use, and honestly, it takes a while for it to lock on. It just feels awkward and uncomfortable to use. It is viable, just not for me. Much like every other survivor I've mentioned with a good utility skill that works with purity, the Engineer can definitely run the Blast Showered Reynolds Band build, as the Harpoons will proc the Reynolds Band guaranteed. It actually has almost as much damage per harpoon that Rex's alternate utility skill does, so it is much stronger. The only problem with this is that you rely less on your turrets because you're reducing their ability to actually proc things. Because of course, turrets inherit your purity, which makes them proc things a lot less. So if you want to run an Engineer build that relies entirely on you and a lot less on your turrets, then go ahead and play this build with a purity. A single purity will work. So that's it. That's all the survivors and all of their viability regarding the purity. I obviously did not do the captain because, again, and I'll explain one more time, the captain is absolute butt with the purity. His M1 is the best in the game at proccing things, and you're just gimping yourself by getting a purity to ruin that M1. His power taser is borderline useless and has a 6-second cooldown, which is longer than most. His utility skill, while strong, is not even available in certain areas and has a pretty long cooldown, so you need multiple purities for it to work. Finally, his special only has 2 uses to it, so it doesn't matter what the cooldown is on them. Here's a quick summary in a TLDW. The Purity is good on Acrid because it reduces the cooldown of his M2s, which are already really low cooldowns to begin with. The Purity is not good on the Artificer because of the fact that her skills are already low cooldown and most of her skills won't work with it very well, i.e. she just lacks synergy with the item. The Commando is good with the Purity because he has an M2 that is strong and has a really low cooldown. Also, his utility skill has the ability to allow him to jump in the air, and having a hard light afterburner or even multiple Purities will allow him to float in the air. The Engineer can use the Purity if you want to go the thermal harpoons, but otherwise cannot go the Purity as it will reduce the effectiveness of his turrets. Huntress is just straight up bad with the item as none of her abilities have any synergy with it at all, and she likes on hit items, which the Purity reduces the effectiveness of. The Loader can actually use the Purity very well because of his Charged Gauntlet and Thunder Gauntlet. However, his M2 is not very good with it because of the way the M2 works. Mercenary is really good with the Purity because his M2 has a really low cooldown, and the Mercenary's shift/utility skill allows him to have multiple blinding assaults, and with a single hardlight afterburner paired with the Purity, you could have almost infinite amounts of blinding assaults. MUL-T is terrible with the Purity because none of his abilities have any synergy with the item. And finally, Rex is okay with the Purity because of his alternate M2 and his shift ability. And that's it. That's every survivor's viability with the Purity in Risk of Rain 2. Turns out after all this experimentation that the Purity wasn't as F tier as I thought it was, although it's still not really that meta. Takes very specific builds to get going, and it can reduce the effectiveness of a lot of items. Plus, there are certain survivors that are just, in general, never going to pick up the item because it's terrible on them. But that's it. If you enjoyed, make sure to turn the red button gray. Hope everyone has a nice day.